That's why. But I just love being in one place, getting to know the same place season after season, watching the changes. Yeah, I'm a real stick in the mud, which is a good thing because my husband is too, so.
I'm sure he's not. Oh, do you garden together?
He does the big, as an architect and a designer, he's built lots of walls and terraces, and so he does the bones, you know, the skeleton, the scaffolding of our place, and the paths, he's done all kinds of things, and I do the growing things, you know, and he goes out and I say dig a hole there, and he does. Usually.
Because I think this area is there's so many people that are involved in gardening, and it's part of their, really, I think their spiritual practice.
Absolutely.
In a way.
We're so lucky. I mean, it's so beautiful and so varied, and the rock formations, we're on particularly rocky land, and it's just so inspiring, you know. And you can keep doing new things, and then you take a tree down, and the sort of ecology changes. The sun comes in, and you kind of try things. I'm having a great
noticing the seasons. I think is an ancient idea.
Yes,
you know.
Yes, and the meditation can help you with that too, because each day, you know, you're repeating, and yet it's a different day. You look out the window, it's a different season. I keep a journal, and so. That, you know, keep a record of the
Is there rhyme in the journal?
When I get ideas, I kind of will stick them in, but they say, you know, it's not really, actually the journal nowadays, I've kept a journal for almost all my adult life, but now, since I write in it after I meditate each morning, so it's more connected to the meditation than to anything that I'm doing, you know, for the children's books or...
I wanted you to tell me a little bit about this book that you won the National Book Award for.
The paperback version of it, right, right. But the hardcover is so much prettier. The paperback's about half the size. It's called A House is a House for Me, and again, it has a refrain, a house is a house for me, which keeps repeating itself. And I wrote it back, I guess, about 15 years ago, I would think. And it's illustrated by a woman named Betty Fraser, who's a wonderful, wonderful illustrator. And she's subsequently done several of my books, including the newest one that's out. And it just starts off, I'll read a little bit to you.
Okay.
First of all, it's dedicated to Norman, builder of my house, my architect husband.
That's great.
Anyway, and it starts off, a hill is a house for an ant, a hive is a house for a bee, a hole is a house for a mole or a mouse, and a house is a house for me. And then Betty will illustrate one kind of house that happens to be a tree house. A web is a house for a spider, a bird builds its nest in a tree. There's nothing so snug as a bug in a rug, and a house is a house for me. And it goes on and on that way with animals and where they live. And a kennel's a house for a dog is a house for a flea. But when a dog strays, a flea sometimes stays, and then it may move in on me.
Right. For us locally.
Right. We've all had that experience. And it gets kind of, it just goes on and it builds and it builds. And let's see. Well, it talks about pockets being houses for pennies and pens being houses for ink. And then it ends this way. A house is a house for a story. A book is a house for a story. A rose is a house for a smell. My head is a house for a secret I never will tell. A flower's at home in a garden. A donkey's at home in a stall. Each creature that's known has a house of its own. And the earth is a house for us all.
Gives me goosebumps. That's so sweet.
That book almost wrote itself. It's wonderful. Sometimes, you know, books take different lengths of time, and poems do. But that was written as a long poem, and as I say, it was given to me almost. I always felt that way.
And the architecture is particularly symbolic, isn't it?
Yeah. And
with your husband?
Absolutely, it all fits in. It really does. It all fits in.
And you were saying that it also is taught to children as a...
Well, they just, it turns out, you know, they have different units, I guess, in curricula. And this, I guess, first graders or second graders, I think it's first, have the house and home and the family as one of their units. And it's turned out that this book has become pretty standard, which is very nice because it sells a lot of copies. and
it's an introduction to...
And it's an introduction to houses, and so the children will figure out their own house. You know, they'll go on from, they think of, let's see, they think of one, I could write a whole other book with the ideas they've had for what houses are and what they're for. And they send me books that they've made. And when I go into schools, they're all familiar with it. So it's nice. I hit the jackpot once.
Do you think any of them go on to be architects?
I don't know if they become architects, but of course, children love to write stories and poems and draw. And when you go into a class and you ask who wants to be a writer, or who wants to be an artist, or who isn't a writer, and all the hands go up, it gets killed later on, unfortunately. And now that they're cutting so many of the art programs in schools and the music programs, it's really bad. But anyway.
Well, these things go in cycles, and hopefully it will come back.
Well,
we have to get up and fight for it, perhaps.
We have to fight for it, absolutely.
Yes, right.
And the National Endowment and funding for that and all of the above, yeah.
When we come back, we're going to further our conversation with Marianne Hoberman and her wonderful children's books. Thank you. This is Mary Michele for WVIP, and I'm back with Marianne Hoberman. She is an author of children's books, and we're going to continue our conversations about the various ways that her beautiful books have inspired so many. I wanted to ask you about this one book in particular. Is it Fathers, Mothers, Sisters, and Brothers?
Fathers, Mothers, Sisters, Brothers. A collection of family poems.
And this book was written when you decided to go back to school?
No, this was actually, I met with a dry patch, writer's block, whatever. It was, probably about 12 years ago, even longer. My father had died. My children were really quite grown up, and it wasn't coming to me, the stuff for young kids. And so I went out, I got a couple of jobs, including one at the Jung Foundation in New York, and I worked for them part-time for a while, and a couple of other office things. I decided I got exhausted running into New York, etc. And so what else to do? Go back to school.
Right.
So I went to graduate school, and I went to work, and I sort of was fulfilling a lifetime dream. I went to Yale, and I worked toward my doctorate in English literature, and I had a wonderful time, and I got through all but dissertation. And my dissertation, I wrote a prospectus for it, and it was going to be on the sister-brother relationship in 19th century women's English literature, the Brontes, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, George Eliot, Jane Austen, all of whom had brothers, and all of whom, except Jane Austen, said at one point or another, my brother is the most important person in my life. And that's very different from our sort of Freudian, parent-child kind of emphasis in this century, which is changing again now. Robert Bly's just come out with that book, The Sibling Society.
Yes.
Anyway.
So you think it's going back to that idea of the brother-sister?
I think that sibling ties, which have always obviously been terribly important, but I think now, with perhaps people living longer, with smaller families, and a lot of people not having children, I think that I think sibling relationships are kind of taking on a new importance, but they never were unimportant.
Right, of course.
And in the 19th century, particularly for sisters, that was my emphasis, where girls often didn't marry, where they weren't allowed to do things that boys were allowed to do. They weren't allowed to get educations and go out of the home. Their brothers often were the only males of their own generation that they got to know at all well. And it's played out in many, many ways in these novels and in the lives of these novels.
How fascinating.
It is fascinating. Yeah. I'm so sorry I never did it, but I wrote a very long perspective.
Yeah. Well, anyway, you did get it out in this.
Well, in a way I did, yeah. And then, So I meant to do that dissertation, but I didn't. And I got home, and it was so nice to sort of, after having passed the orals and everything, to come home and see my friends and have lunch with them and work in my garden, etc. And the dissertation did not get written. I just didn't have the discipline for it. But I did get back. I had a second wind with children's books. And so I've been writing lots of children's books since. And one of them is this one, Fathers, Mothers, Sisters, Brothers. And it's just a subject very close to my heart. And I sort of drew up a lot of memories of my own childhood. And I just had a lot of fun with it.
I think oftentimes, don't you, in life, it's circuitous,
yes,
right?
Yeah, you come round and round again, absolutely.
And sometimes you have to work very, very hard in one direction to bring it to clarity in another.
And to get back
so
to
I
the
think,
beginning.
and this is really important. I think that children's books, I think, are as important sometimes to the parents for them to get to the heart of what it is that they really need to know, to make it said the most simply.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I was just in New York at a school in Spanish, a Spanish-speaking school, public school, where I spent 3 days recently, and a lot of the mothers who came, they had a workshop too. They don't speak very good English. Some of them don't speak at all, and they're not very educated, some of them, in Spanish either. And they were each given a copy of this book by the foundation that sponsored it, and they treated the book as a book, not as a children's book, but as a book. It was very gratifying. There's one poem in here that maybe I'll read.
Yes,
because,
go for it, yeah.
I think it really is sort of speaking to a lot of this meant a lot. Usually when I do this poem, it's called 4 Generations, and I ask children if they know what a generation is. I couldn't even explain to you or define to you a generation. So the kids too, but they'll say, well, my mom or my, that kind of, yes. And so I get 4 little boys, usually little boys because the pictures are of boys. And I say that you're the young man who's saying the poem, and the next one is he's your father, and the next one he's your grandpa, and the next one he's your great-grandpa. And so here we go, 4 generations. Sometimes when we go out for walks, I listen while my father talks. The thing he talks of most of all is how it was when he was small and he went walking with his dad, and conversations that they had about his father and the talks they had when they went out for walks.
Oh.
And so it's done in 4 little, couplets. And so we can talk about all kinds of things with that. But the children get a great kick out of that, it was figuring out who, and it's all... anyway.
That's great.
But so that poem, it's very, very simple, but it sort of touches on something in our family. Till my mother died recently, we had our 4 generations too, and it's a wonderful feeling.
Well, I think people are endlessly interested in the thing about the family and how it all works and how it's connected.
And they're so different now. That's another thing that I tried to do in this book, because families are not just the little nuclear family anymore. And a lot of kids feel left out if you just say a family consists of mommy and daddy and Dick and Jane and the puppy. And so I wrote poems about brothers and sisters and half brothers and sisters. There's one called Half Whole Step. And, about adoption and divorce. There's a poem about divorce. It isn't said, but it's about a little boy who says, my father doesn't live with us. It doesn't pay to make a fuss. But yet I feel unhappy. I miss him, and that's the little refrain each time.
Well, it's nice, I think, for people to think that it's not that they're not normal.
Absolutely.
Right?
You're right. Yeah. Well, the normal thing these
What
days.
is, exactly, what is normal?
The not normal thing is the
right.
nuclear family.
Exactly.
And so I wrote a kind of catch-all poem, a beginning introduction poem that asks the question, what is a family? Who is a family? And then answers it in all kinds of ways. And in the end, it's somebody... let's say all of your family plus you is a family, and that's it. It can be one person, it can be a dozen people. That's what a family is.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful idea.
Anyway, I had a very good time writing that book, and I love the illustrations by a woman named Marilyn Hafner, and they're all colors, all shapes, all sizes, and that too is part of the theme.
Okay, The question I would like, the final question, well, it may not be the final question, but to wrap it all up, because the nature of what I'm trying to do in all of my conversations is talk about the nature of taking time. And I think that taking time is something that one does in a meditative, reflective kind of way. So your final book, My Song, well, not your final book, but your most recent, recent book, talks somewhat about this idea of meditative or reflective. The poetry is...
I think so. It's the first anthology that I have done. In other words, it's not, these are not my poems. I wrote one poem for the book, but I've collected poems. And then we had the idea of getting a different illustrator to do each poem. So it's really quite a unique book. And it's the subtitle of this one is Poems and Pictures in Many Voices. And what I tried to do, I wanted all the poems to be in the first person, and I wanted the poems to be by poets of different backgrounds, different nationalities, different locations, etc.
I think this is great. With this one is
in a hermit's cottage. Yeah. This is by Kim Soo-jang, who's probably, I think, Korean probably. In a hermit's cottage, silent, still, I sit alone with nobody, and a white cloud dozes to the strains of a quiet song. No one can know how happy I am.
Oh.
And children really, you know, you can get a quicker reaction with humor and with nonsense verse, but that's not all that they respond to. And this is a poem that children respond to. Back to the other book, the family book, one of the favorites is, it's a child is saying, sometimes I like to be alone and look up at the sky and think my thoughts inside my head. Just me, myself, and I. And that's one that they really like.
Well, that's quite a spiritual idea, really.
I guess so. I guess so. And it's particularly beautiful because in the Spanish-speaking school, there are a lot of bilingual classes, and the children translated it into Spanish for me, and it really is beautiful in Spanish. And then this is the poem that I wrote for this book. And this is an idea, yes, it's put forward as a children's poem, but the idea in it, to me, is it's not only a child's idea, and not even to say only a child. We get our best ideas when we're children, and then we just work on them and go back to them as we get older. At least that's my own experience.
That's my experience, too. I hear you.
And so this one is called You and I. And this is one of my favorite things that I've written, I think. Only one I in the whole wide world, and millions of you. But every you is an I to itself, and I am a you to you too. But if I am a you, and you are an I, and the opposite also is true, it makes us both the same somehow, yet splits us each in two. It's more and more mysterious, the more I think it through. Every you, everywhere in the world is an I. Every I in the world is a you.
Oh.
And it was illustrated. This one is illustrated. We commissioned this. Children made this wonderful quilt, and they're all self-portraits.
How wonderful.
Isn't that lovely?
That's wonderful.
So that's the illustration for that one. So I love this book. I'm very proud of it.
Is this the most recent book?
No, the really most recent book is the cozy book.
Okay.
And that one is, I was telling your mom, I guess, before when I was talking to her, that this one was illustrated by another illustrator early on, and then went out of print, and then has just been reissued with illustrations by Betty Fraser, the same illustrator who did A House is a House for me. And this book is just a list of all the... Cozy is one of my favorite words and my favorite concepts. And this just goes right through cozy foods, cozy clothes, cozy places, cozy people, cozy words. And it just... you know, it's a kind of cozy book, and the children all can kind of settle back when they're listening to it. And it's a very nice good night. You know, it's a nice book to read to children before they go to sleep.
I want to thank Marian Hoberman so much for being here with me today. It really was wonderful. And I love the idea of her poetry and rhythm, and I think it fits with the idea of taking time. I'm Mary Michele for WVIP. Thank you.
You're the founder of an unusual service. It's called the Maids. How did it originate?
When my wife and I moved to Westchester, we were, both of us, busy all the week long, and so we found it difficult to get help to keep our house clean. We wanted, of course, reliable, honest, hard-working folks whom we could trust, and truthfully, we found that very difficult.
I see, and so it is that you started your own service and you called it the Maids.
That's right. You can always reach me here in the Westchester neighborhood. I have a toll-free number for your convenience, 800.
Bill, you ran us. Hello, Robert. How are you?
Good.
Robert, this is Grace Mirabelle.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Mrs.
I'm so happy I hear a lot about you. I'm so happy to hear you.
Good.
See you.
What do you got for us?
Okay, today I
Please
have
tell Mrs.
pan-seared tuna with
wow.
marinated diced vegetables and a little salad greens.
And so beautifully presented. Now, do you do this? Do you do the artwork here, too?
Yes, that's me.
You do?
Yeah, actually, that's the funnest part of the job.
Is it?
Yeah.
You like that. You like it, and I'm sure people appreciate that, too.
Yeah, I hope to think so.
Well, now what we're going to do is appreciate the food.
Great, great.
So thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you.
Right.
Enjoy
Thanks
it.
so
Bye-bye.
much.
Grace,
That's
if I
great.
may interrupt.
Yes, before I even
Before
start.
you even start.
Right.
And once in a while, I will allow you to have your bite.
Thank you.
Okay. You've just written a book,
Yes.
In and Out of Vogue. Great title because it tells the story, does it not?
Right.
And the story of your life, a large part of it is Vogue magazine.
Oh, sure, it is. Yes.
But before we talk about Vogue magazine and about Marabella, your magazine, named after you, I'd like to talk a little bit about Bedford, if you don't mind, because here we are in Bedford.
Right.
And as I recall reading, not necessarily your book alone, but your husband's book as well, he talks about how you met. What was it, 1971, I think
Right.
is the date.
Not bad.
And first it was at some party, was it not?
It was at a party. That was in New York.
Yeah, and that was casual
Right,
and
right.
not,
Right.
what's the word? Definite.
Yeah, not nothing. Not nothing.
And then the second time you met, which got to be a little more meaningful, was in all places in Bedford Village.
In Bedford Village, in the Bedford Green Antique.
Bedford Green Antique.
Right.
With two friends of yours
With
who were
two
running
pals,
it. Yeah.
right.
And that, I gather that meaning was more meaningful, if
Yeah.
you will, and meeting.
Oh, well, yes, I guess it
And, but
indeed
at the
was.
time, you weren't living in Bedford, were you?
No, I was visiting Sandra, Sandra Casper, who was
Uh-huh.
then Feigen. I was visiting for the weekend, and I went over to see the shop because that shop, you may remember, was on a Saturday, kind of a meeting place. People sort of dropped in and hung around, and
Did you know it was the site of one of the original A&P?
I knew it because eventually I did see
The history.
pictures and
Yeah,
posts, and,
yeah.
you know, that kind wonderful.
Now,
I love that
but
village.
you were brought up in New Jersey, were
Yes,
you not?
yes.
Was it cityfied?
Oh, where I was brought up was, sort of, sure was not suburban.
No.
It was sort of citified.
Yeah.
No, I shouldn't say that. I was born in a city, but I was brought up in suburbs. I
In
should have
suburbs,
said that,
yeah. And
Yeah,
as
Maplewood and
I
South
gather, your
Orange.
original work was what, at Macy's and
Macy's
Saks?
training program.
Yeah, so you had the retail
I
background.
had retail because that's what I longed to do.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were at